Hello everybody, this is FIDE Master Dalton Perrine, and I welcome you to this Chess Openings 101 Intro to Benoni Defense video course here today. Throughout this 4-part video course, I'm going to be helping you to better understand the Benoni defense, the main themes and plans for white and black, how to play the opening yourself, how to play against it, as well as different tactical tricks and patterns that you'll want to memorize if you're going to play with this opening or play against this opening. The goal of this video course is for you to get better at the opening overall so that you can either play it yourself or you can know what to do against it if you happen to face it. And the better you understand this opening, the better you understand its structures and plans, then the better your results will be when you do happen to encounter this opening. The progression of material throughout the video course is pretty much going to be as follows. The first video that you're watching here is going to be a basic overview of the opening as well as a brief history behind it, as well as a couple of some of the basics of what white should do and what black should do. The second video is going to teach you how to play the opening yourself as black. It's going to go a bit more in depth than this first video. And the third video is going to teach you how to play the opening as white, again a bit more in depth than this first video. And the fourth and final video is going to introduce some puzzles to solve that will revolve around some different patterns in this particular opening. So first of all, let's see what the basic opening moves are that are going to be played in order to reach the Benoni defense. The basic opening moves for the most part involve 1d4, black playing knight f6, pawn to c4 for white, pawn to c5 for black, pawn to d5 for white, kind of advancing the pawn forward, and then black will play the move e6. So this is the start of the Benoni defense opening. Now this particular position can arise from a few different move orders as well. So instead of these first three moves for both players, it might arise instead starting off with maybe 1c4. Black might still play knight f6, then white plays d4, black might play c5, d5, e6 for example. So again, a different first starting move, but essentially still reaching the same position. Another way you can reach it, again just showing some different move orders here, could start off with d4 on move number 1. Instead of knight f6, maybe black plays c5 immediately. White goes for d5, knight f6, c4, e6. Again, same opening position, just a slightly different move order. And black might also decide to go e6 immediately, c4, knight f6. Again, just a couple of different move orders here, but this is the main position that we're going to be starting off with. This is the Benoni defense as we're going to define it in this video here. Pawn up on d5 for white, along with the pawn on c4. e6, knight f6, pawn on c5 for black here. So this opening position was first used, giving you a little bit of history on it, it was first used in 1927 by Frank Marshall, and Frank Marshall was a famous player from the United States, famous for the Marshall Gambit if you've heard of that particular line, also a very strong player in his own right. For the most part, this opening was not very popular until about the 1950s, when some players from the Soviet Union began to experiment with it, and foremost among these players was Mikhail Tal, famous for being a world champion of chess at one point, also one of the most famous attacking players in the history of chess. And as we're going to see, this opening definitely fits his style. It is definitely a combative, fighting opening, especially if you're playing it for black side of the board. Later on, players with aggressive and fighting styles, such as Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov, began to use this opening as well, and thus it gained its reputation as one of the most dynamic openings to play against the move order of 1d4. So from this position here, we can already see a few advantages that each side of the board has. Within the first three moves, white has gained a center space advantage at this point. He's advanced the d-pawn up to the d5 square, and it's kind of crossed into black's half of the board, if you consider the 5th rank and backwards being black's half of the board here. So that pawn has advanced into black's territory, essentially. However, the downside for white here is that black has been able to gain a development lead in the process, because white has only made pawn moves so far. First three moves are all pawn moves. In the meantime, black has at least developed one knight at this point, which is a lead in development that black has gained. So there are definitely pluses and minuses to this opening that have to be understood in order to play it comfortably. From this position on the board now, let me get rid of these arrows real quick. From this position on the board now, white has a few options that are reasonable to continue with. White can play for knight to c3, which this video course is primarily going to focus on. but knight f3 also works out as a good move order too. Now, one move that you generally don't want to play here is the move pawn takes e6. The reason you don't usually want to do this move is because you're trading off the pawn that you've already moved 2 times, and black is usually going to capture back with f takes e6, and later on he's going to play d5 himself, and it's going to in turn give black, instead of white getting the space advantage, black will get the space advantage. So from this position, usually white will go ahead and make the move knight to c3 instead. That's what we're going to focus on in this video course. And from here, black will usually play pawn takes d5, and white will recapture with the c pawn in order to maintain this strong space controlling pawn on the d5 square. If instead you use the knight to capture back on d5, while you do get a good nice square, square for the knight, you don't have that same space control generally, and so for the most part, we're going to be focusing on c takes d5, giving white that space advantage. Now from here, usually black will play 5 pawn to d6. This is the typical continuation, and from here, again, there's many move variations the game can proceed with. Now, before we look at specific moves that follow from here, and that's going to be a little bit of the focus in the future videos as well, one of the most important things to take note of are the pawn majorities that are created by this pawn exchange on d5 that we had. Now, a pawn majority in chess is defined as having more pawns than your opponent on a portion of the board or a particular side of the board. Now, in this particular case, if we kind of split the board into the kingside and queenside halves, it ends up that white has a pawn majority on the king side. White has 4 pawns versus black's 3 on the king side here. On the other side of the board, though, black has a pawn majority on the queen side with his 4 versus white's 3. Now, despite white having that extra space-controlling pawn on d5, it actually ends up that black has a pawn majority on the queen side with that 4 versus 3. So this pawn majority observation and idea is a big driving force in the way that this opening is played out into the middle game and further along as the game proceeds for the most part. For this reason, the main plans for both white and black are usually going to focus around these pawn majorities. Whenever you have a pawn majority on one side of the board, this means that you have the ability to gain a bigger space advantage on that side of the board by advancing your majority farther up the board. So again, for this reason, white primarily wants to play on the king side, while black is usually going to focus on the queen side. Again, in line with their the side that they have the pawn majority on. Now, this isn't always 100% the case. There are some situations where white will make some moves on the queen side, and there are definitely situations where black will make moves on the king side as well. But in general, it's a principle to keep in mind as you begin to learn the opening. White wants to play on the king side primarily, black wants to play on the queen side mostly. If you don't, maybe you run into a position as you play this opening and you don't know exactly what to do, it's almost always a good idea to play on the side of the board where you have your pawn majority, where you're going to usually have a little bit of extra space. Now, because we even from the start here, we kind of understand what part of the board each side wants to play on. One question we might even ask, just as an example, where do you think that black is going to develop this bishop on f8? Where is he going to develop his dark square bishop? Essentially, we have 2 options. Should the bishop go to e7, or should it fianchetto to the g7 square after black makes a move like g6, for example? Well, clearly, the bishop on g7 is going to exert more pressure on the queen side, and we did say that's the side of the board black primarily wants to focus on. So it makes a lot more sense for black to fianchetto the dark square bishop, and that is typically a main setup of pieces that black will usually do. He'll usually follow up within the next couple of moves with g6 and bishop g7 to have that bishop aim in the direction of the queen side. Now, this is just one example of how understanding the way that the opening works can help us to develop our pieces more efficiently, to have them on better squares, without putting them on squares that they're not going to be as useful on. So let's take a look at 2 examples just briefly, mainly to show how this opening can be played for white and how this opening can be played for black. Our next 2 videos in this video course are going to go a bit more in depth on some of the ideas and plans that white can have as well as what black can have. So for now, we're just going to have brief comments on these 2 game examples. The next 2 videos will be a bit more in depth. So let's see our first example focusing on the black pieces, where black is going to win in this particular game by use of a queenside play. So let's put this game on the board. I'm going to flip it. Now this is actually a game that Mikhail Tal played as black. He was playing against a player named Jan Donner. I might be pronouncing that a little bit off. But like we said earlier, Tal was one of the practitioners of this opening that helped to kind of revitalize it, to kind of get it into the mainstream. Let's kind of look through this opening a little bit and see how some queenside play that black uses helps him to win the game a bit later as it continues on. So let's kind of just click through the opening to show, again, those starting off moves. D4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, e6, knight c3, pawn takes, d6. So again, we have that same setup. And let's kind of just see how both sides continue from here. Again, the next videos will go a little more in depth. White plays knight f3. Black does go for g6 and prepares to fianchetto the bishop. White plays e4, gaining some space in the center, as well as pushing one of the pawns within his majority on the king side. Bishop g7, bishop to d3, again, aiming a little bit in the direction of the king side here, and also supporting the center pawn. Castle, castle. Castle makes sense. And now black goes for a6. Now this move might look a little weird, but again, the idea is to play on the queen side, and black wants to push his majority as well. Ideally, if white does nothing, black will play the move b5. If white, for example, just plays rook e1, b5 might follow, and black is gaining more space on the queen side of the board. So here white decided to play the move a4 to stop this b5 idea, a little bit of preventive play. Black played bishop g4, h3, and trades off this bishop. Again, this is, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in a future video, in the video course, but black is looking to trade off a knight that was going to support some of the kingside play that white had. Knight to d7, bishop to f4, queen to c7, protecting the pawn on d6. Queen e2, rook e8, a little bit of counterattacking in the center might follow here. But as we're going to see the game continue on, black is looking to hit the bishop, f4, trades off the bishop on the queen side, knight to d7, rook e1, queen b6, and queen to b4. Black is looking to trade queens here. Generally, when you're playing on the queen side versus an opponent who's playing on the king side, usually trading queens is a good idea because when the queens are off the board, it's a bit harder to play on the king side. It's harder to attack. And black doesn't mind the queen side. This trade will help him on the queen side. It might seem like the pawns are bad for black. It looks like he's doubling his pawns. But the problem is that after a move like knight d1, black now follows up with knight c5, attacking these two different pawns. And there's no way white can protect both. In this position, black would win a pawn here. So black is okay with this queen trade. White decides to avoid it with queen f1, but black decides to continue pushing his majority. c4, b5. He trades on c3. There's a trade of a couple of pawns. But now black has this passed pawn on the c-file. One of the big things with pawn majorities as well is that when you have a pawn majority, you can usually create a passed pawn with it. Black has now created this passed c-pawn, and he's going to advance it. And eventually white ended up resigning here because it's hard to guard the pawn and stop its advance, and black will also protect the square in front of it. For example, if white plays e5, c2, rook here, knight b3, the pawn's protected, black's going to win material, and black is going to win the game here. So this is just one quick example. Again, I didn't go too in-depth on this, on all the specific moves here, but this is just one quick example showing how black can win through queenside play in this particular opening. Let's see an example of white winning through kingside play. Again, not to show a bias for either side of the board, but mainly just showing an overall understanding for how the opening works. So let's see an example of white winning through kingside play briefly here. This again actually is a game that Mikhail Tal was playing, but in this case, Mikhail Tal was still playing it as black, and white was actually able to outmuscle Mikhail Tal. White was able to win the game here. White was a player named Jonathan Penrose, and we're going to see how he won through a kingside attack. So the same opening setup for the most part. Slightly different move order here. Played e6 before c5, but essentially we're reaching the exact same opening setup. Again, e4, g6, bishop d3, bishop g7, knight e2, castle, castle, a6. Again, a6, black wants to play b5. And white goes for a4, again, to stop the move b5. Or this is going to kind of be a common pattern we're going to see throughout a lot of white's play, preventing black from getting that queenside expansion. Queen to c7, h3, knight d7, f4. White is advancing his pawn majority on the king side once again. Rook e8, knight g3, again aiming things in the direction of the king side. c4, bishop c2, but black is also pushing on the queen side as well. Knight c5, queen f3, knight d7, bishop e3, b5. Pawn takes, rook b8. Black is willing to make a pawn sacrifice. If white takes, black will take on b2 and continue to use his queenside play. White plays queen f2, pawn takes back, and white now advances that kingside pawn majority with e5. This is a pawn sacrifice as well, but it's looking to gain space. Pawn takes e5, f5. So he gives up the pawn on e5 in order to blockade the bishop and take away one of the squares the knight would like to move to. If instead white played f5 immediately, this e5 square is very nice for a knight to sit on, and this bishop is not blocked in either at the same time. So he played e5, pawn takes f5. Black plays bishop b7, rook to d1, bishop to a8, knight e4, knight a4, a trade of bishop for knight real quick, and then a capture on g6, which is opening up the f-file, and white is looking to get a very strong attack on the king side here. Pawn takes back, queen f7 check, king moves, knight to c5, attacking the pinned piece, and also looking to play knight e6, forking the queen and the bishop. Black ends up playing queen a7, white picks up a piece on d7, and essentially white is up a piece here, and white went on to convert the game pretty easily. I'll just show the next couple of moves. Forks the two pawns, takes on c4, pushes the pawn, trades off a pair of rooks, knight b6, knight e4, pushes the pawn, and again, white is simply winning with his extra material, and soon he'll get rid of the blockade in front of the d-pawn. Black ended up resigning in this position because he can't protect the rook anymore. Anywhere he moves the bishop, it'll get captured, and if he takes the rook, of course, white will take back and create a queen. So notice here, in this particular case, white was able to open up the king side, get a big attack going. So this shows also how white can have dynamic play in this opening as well. So again, it's not that black is always better or white's always better. We've seen two brief examples here of how white can win through kingside attack and also how black can win through queenside play. At the end of the day, it comes down to who can play the opening better. If you can understand the ideas of the opening better than your opponent, you'll usually have a better chance to win. We can really just see that the battle lines in this opening are clearly drawn from the start, and an interesting fight always ensues. If you enjoy combative openings, which have a lot of fun, interesting, imbalanced positions in them, if you like to win, if you like to have battling openings, and definitely like to avoid draws, then this is definitely an opening that you'll like to play. So that's it for this first video. Be sure to check out the other 3 videos in this course, study the positions, learn from our discussion, and apply the tips, tricks, and advice in your own games. And I'm sure you'll get a better understanding of this opening and be better prepared to play with it or against it in your future games that you play. So in the next video, video number 2, we're going to go more in depth on the possible plans for black and how you can get strong play in a variety of positions. I'll see you in that next video, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.